The cold came in off the step like a living thing, low and purposeful, pressing itself against every door and window frame on Mercy Street as if checking for weakness. Daniel Acaffer had lived at number 41 for 6 years, and he knew the sound it made when the temperature dropped past the point of no return. A low hum behind the walls, almost musical, the pipes beginning their long complaint. He was at the kitchen table with his third cup of coffee gone cold beside him, and a manual for a tractor engine spread open in front of him, and he was not reading it. He was listening. Outside, past the frost-feathered glass, the street was empty. It was 3 in the morning. The settlement of Caldwell's Reach had been a farming colony for 80 years before the occupation, and for 11 years since, it had been something harder to name. Not a prison, not quite a reservation, something in between, the way a word sounds different when you say it in a language you only half understand. He heard the sound before he saw her. It was not a scream, it was not a knock, it was something that did not belong to any category. He had a low, continuous tone, almost below the threshold of hearing, more felt in the sternum than perceived through the ear. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds, then silence, then it came again. Daniel set down his coffee cup very carefully, the way a man does when he wants his hands to be steady for whatever comes next. He went to the window. She was at the end of the path, past the gate that hadn't latched properly since the summer before last. She was on her knees in the snow. Her arms were wrapped around herself in a way that looked less like a hug and more like she was holding her own body together, keeping something in or keeping something out. He couldn't tell which. She was wearing nothing appropriate for the weather, something dark and close-fitting that might have been a uniform once, before whatever had happened to it. Her hair was matted flat. The snow had found her. He did not think. He opened the door. The cold hit him like an open hand. He crossed the path in his socks. He would think about this later, the socks, and he crouched down beside her, and when he put his hand on her shoulder, she made the sound again. Up close, it vibrated through his palm and up his forearm and into his teeth. He had never heard anything like it, and he was not afraid of it. "Hey," he said. "Hey, can you look at me?" She looked at him. Her eyes were wrong. Not monstrous, nothing about her was monstrous, which was almost the stranger thing. Her eyes were a color that did not have a name in any language spoken on this planet, something in the space between amber and silver, and the pupils were not round. They adjusted to him in a way that felt too precise, too calibrated, the way the aperture of a very good camera finds its subject. She was assessing him, and he knew it, and it did not matter. "You're freezing," he said. She did not respond in words. She looked at the door of his house, then at him, then at the door again. The meaning was unmistakable. "Yeah," he said, "come on." He got her upright. She was heavier than she looked and lighter than she looked at the same time, which shouldn't have been possible but was. She moved her legs under her without his instruction and walked with him to the door, not leaning on him, but accepting his steadying hand at her elbow in the way that a very proud person accepts help when they have no other option. He registered this. He stored it away in the part of his mind that noticed things. Inside, he sat her at the kitchen table where he had just been sitting. The warmth of the room seemed to reach her slowly, like it was having to negotiate with her biology first. He pulled his work jacket off the hook by the door and draped it over her shoulders. She looked down at it with an expression he could not read. "It's not much," he said. "I'll make tea. Do you as tea?" She looked at the kettle as he filled it, following the water with that precise attention, and he had the sudden vivid sense of being watched by something that understood everything he was doing and nothing about why. He put the kettle on. He sat across from her. "My name is Daniel," he said. She made no sound. Then slowly she placed her right hand flat on the table between them. The palm was toward him. The gesture was so deliberate it had to be a word in a language he didn't know. He placed his own hand flat on the table the same way, mirroring her. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not exactly, but something that performed a similar function. The kettle began to sing. Her name, as best as he could render it, was something he eventually shortened to Ale. She did not offer it as a name. She produced the sound when he asked what to call her, and the sound was 3 syllables, of which 2 were below comfortable human hearing range. So he took the one he could pronounce, and she accepted the reduction without apparent objection. He would learn later that this was not indifference. It was trust. Among her kind, permitting your name to be translated was the equivalent of handing someone your address in the dark. She was Nhari. He knew the word from the compliance bulletins posted in the settlement office every 3rd month: known species, threat classification, and the Nhari were listed on the 2nd page, which meant they were considered significant but not emergency level. What the bulletins did not mention, what no bulletin ever mentioned, was what the Nhari actually were, which was this: a migratory intelligence, spacefaring for longer than humanity had had writing, with a culture of such complexity and such profound restraint that their word for war was also their word for failure, and both were considered obscene in polite company. He did not know any of this yet. He just knew that she was cold, and that she was in his kitchen, and that someone had left her there. He found this unacceptable. She stayed for 3 days. He gave her his spare room, which was also his storage room, which meant she slept between a stack of seed catalogs from 4 years ago and a broken bread maker he had been meaning to fix since before the occupation. He cleared a path to the bed. She looked at the room and then at him with that same unreadable assessment, and something he would later recognize as amusement. She communicated in pieces at first. Gesture, expression, the angle of her body in space. She was fluent in a vocabulary of posture he had to learn by guessing and correcting. When he guessed right, she made a brief low sound. When he guessed wrong, she would tilt her head very slightly to one side, patient, and try again. He began to feel, by the 2nd day, that he was the one being taught rather than the one doing the teaching. He didn't mind. He had always learned better by doing than by reading, which was why the tractor manual was still open at the same page. On the 2nd evening, she came to the kitchen while he was cooking and watched him chop onions for 15 minutes without moving. He had grown up in a family that didn't believe in self-consciousness, so he just kept chopping. Eventually, she reached across and took the knife from him with a calmness so complete it didn't feel like taking, and she made 2 modifications to the angle and pressure of the cut, and the onion fell apart differently. Better, he looked at her. She looked at the onion. He started laughing, and the sound seemed to surprise her. She went very still, the way animals go still at a sound they haven't catalogued, and then something happened in her face that was the closest thing he'd seen to a smile. "Yeah," he said, "I know, I've been doing it wrong the whole time." What she did then, slowly, carefully, as though testing a conclusion, she put her hand to her own chest and then moved it outward, fingers spreading, and the gesture meant something. He didn't know what exactly. He understood it the way you understand music, not literally, but in the place where meaning lives before it becomes a word. On the 3rd morning, he came downstairs before light and found her at the window, standing absolutely still, watching the dark street. He stood in the doorway. "Someone's coming," he said. It wasn't a question. She did not turn from the window. After a moment, she made a sound he hadn't heard before, short, clipped, with a harmonic overtone that made the fillings in his back teeth vibrate. He understood it as an affirmation. He understood it as, yes, and soon. "How many?" She held up 4 fingers. He thought about this. He went to the kitchen and made coffee because it was something to do with his hands, because thinking always went better when his hands were occupied. He thought about the compliance bulletins, which he had to sign every month, which he had always signed without reading past the required fields. He thought about the occupation's official policy on non-human persons of interest, which was a phrase that meant different things in different documents and nothing clear in any of them. He thought about Ale at his table on the first night, both hands flat on the surface, and the quality of stillness she'd had then, not peace exactly, not calm. something more like a person who has stopped fighting what is inevitable and is deciding, very carefully, what to do next. He took his coffee back to the sitting room. He sat across from her, and he put his mug on the table between them, and he said, "You don't have to go if you don't want to." She looked at him for a long time. He didn't know enough of her language to know what she was feeling. He knew enough of being human to know what he was. The four who came arrived just after dawn, when the light was gray and horizontal, and the street was still empty. They were not wearing the armor from the compliance bulletin images. They were in civilian clothing, the loose dark-colored garments that the Keth wore when they were not in their administrative capacity, which meant they were here off the record. The Keth were not Enhari. They were the managing species of this occupation, the administrators, and there was a long and complicated history between them and the Enhari that Danel did not know and would spend the next 3 years learning, and the short version of it was: the Enhari were here by the Keth's designation, stranded on a human-administered world, and they stayed at the Keth's discretion. And every once in a while a Enhari who had done something the Keth considered insubordinate was simply left somewhere unsurvivable, and the paperwork described it as a navigation error. He knew none of the history. He opened the door before they knocked. There were 4 of them. The one in front was taller than the others, with the heavy brow ridge and the secondary eyelids that classified them as Keth rather than anything else, and its translator unit blinked green at its collar when it spoke. "Compliance notification," it said. The voice that came from the translator was flat and over-precise in the way all translated speech was, like every sentence had been ironed. "You are believed to be harboring a registered non-human person of interest. We are authorized to retrieve." Danel stood in the doorway with his coffee in his hand. "Harboring," he said. "That is the registered classification." "She was in the snow," Danel said. "At 3 in the morning she was on her knees." The Keth blinked its secondary eyelids. The other 3 said nothing. There was, behind the lead Keth's stillness, the faint quality of something that was not quite impatience, something denser than that, more like the pressure before weather. "Your cooperation is expected," it said. "I'm not being uncooperative," Danel said. "I'm asking a question. She was on her knees in the snow at 3 in the morning. How'd she get there?" A pause. "Navigation error." "That's interesting," Danel said, "because she walked to my gate under her own power, so she knows exactly where she is." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a conversation has gone somewhere the other party hadn't planned for. Danel had been in enough negotiations, water rights, crop licensing, the grinding bureaucracy of a colony under occupation, to know what silence like that meant. It meant he had said something that was true and inconvenient, and they were deciding how to respond to the truth. "She is registered property of the Keth Administrative Division," the lead Keth said. That was when something in Danel's chest went cold and still. Not anger. He knew anger. This was something quieter and more total, a door closing. "No," he said. The Keth's secondary eyelids blinked again. "Compliance is." "I know what compliance is. I signed the forms. She is a person. You left a person outside in a snowstorm. This is not your concern." "She's in my house," Danel said. "It's my concern." He heard movement behind him, soft, specific. Ale had come to the hallway. He didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the Keth in front of him, and he heard her step beside him, and without looking he moved slightly to his left so there was room for her beside him in the doorway, and she stood there. He felt rather than saw the Keth's gaze move to her. He felt rather than heard whatever passed between them. Ale made no sound, but the air changed the way air changes in a room when someone says something that cannot be unsaid. "She's not going with you," Danel said. The lead Keth looked at him with the full weight of its authority, which was considerable. The occupation had been running for 11 years. The compliance apparatus was 11 years deep, 11 years of signed forms and lowered eyes, and people deciding not to have the argument. The Keth understood the weight of that history, the way a creditor understands debt, as a fact of the world that had always existed and would always exist. "You are one human man," it said, "in a farming settlement with no standing." "That's right," Daniel said. He took a sip of his coffee. There is a particular kind of stubbornness that exists in people who have spent their lives growing things, who have planted in bad soil and waited and tended and lost and planted again. It is not bravado. It is not the dramatic refusal of someone who has weighed the odds and found them acceptable. It is the particular, quiet, impossible to argue with refusal of a person who has simply decided that this is the line here today, and that the line is going to hold because they are standing on it, not because they have any expectation of winning. Daniel Ackafer had been a farmer on a colonized world for 38 years. He knew the line when he felt it under his feet. The Keth measured him for a long moment. "This will be reported," it said. "I know," Daniel said. It turned. The four of them walked back down the path and into the gray morning light, and Daniel stood in the doorway until they were gone from sight. Then he stepped back inside and closed the door and locked it. The manual bolt, which the settlers of Caldwell's Reach had never removed, had never seen a reason to, a 50-year-old piece of iron that the compliance apparatus did not appear on any form. He turned around. Ale was looking at him. He had learned over 3 days to read some of her expressions. Not all, maybe 10%. Enough to know that what was on her face now was not gratitude exactly. It was something larger than gratitude, or perhaps something that came before it, the thing you feel when you have expected the worst from something, and are confronted with evidence that the world is more complicated than your expectation. He said. She made a sound he hadn't heard before. It took him a moment to identify it. It was laughter. The next 6 days were the most complicated and the most ordinary of his life, which is a combination that is only possible when the complicated and the ordinary happen to be made of the same material. Ale stayed. He did not examine this arrangement. It had established itself as a fact, and facts were what you worked with. He worked. She watched, and then she helped, and then on the 3rd day she took over a task he had been doing inefficiently for 6 years with a calm expertise that made him put his tools down and just watch her work for a while. She was communicating, he realized, not just solving the problem. The way she worked was a sentence, and the sentence was, "I am not helpless." He heard it. She was Nhari, which meant she was a navigator. Not a star mapper, not a technician, something more fundamental, something his vocabulary didn't have a clean word for. Her people carried the roots of the world inside them the way migratory birds carry south. She could feel the shape of a place, the pressures and gradients and invisible geometries of location, and she was stranded not because she was lost, but because the Keth had disabled the biological mechanism that let her translate that knowing into movement. It was, he would understand later, the Keth's preferred method of control, not cages, not chains, but the removal of the capacity for direction. You could not flee if you did not know which way to run. She showed him the place on the side of her neck below the jaw where something had been inserted. It was small, almost invisible. He looked at it for a long time without touching it, and then he went to his workshop. He had been a mechanic before he was a farmer. His father had said you needed 2 skills on a colony world, one to grow things and one to fix them when they broke. He understood small, precise systems. He understood the difference between a mechanism that had failed and one that had been deliberately disabled. He understood what tools you needed for each. He went back to the kitchen. He put his tools on the table between them. "I can try," he said. "I'm not a doctor." She looked at the tools. She looked at his hands. She made the sound he had come to understand as both yes and trust, and the fact that her language used the same word for both things seemed, to him, to say something true about the world. He was careful. He was very careful. He had steady hands, and he had always had steady hands, and he thanked his father quietly in his head for the years in the workshop, for the early mornings with the fine components, for the lesson about patience being the most important tool you owned. The device was small and intricate and malicious in the way that only things designed to harm can be malicious, not through complexity, but through simplicity, through the deliberate, elegant exactness of its damage. He did not remove it. He could not remove it without better equipment. But he found the signal component, the part that was actively interfering, and he did what he had done 100 times to 100 broken systems. He interrupted the loop. The sound she made was below hearing. He felt it in his bones. Then she was very still, the kind of still that follows something that has been restored, and he sat back and watched her, and she sat forward and pressed both her palms flat on the table, and this time she was not offering a greeting. She was showing him her hands were shaking. Outside, through the kitchen window, the light on the snow was beginning to change. The settlement was waking up, smoke from other chimneys, a dog barking 2 streets over. The ordinary machinery of a day starting, indifferent to the extraordinary thing that had just happened in this kitchen. "Okay," he said. She pressed her hands flatter against the table, steadying them, and when the shaking stopped she looked up, and the expression on her face was one he knew. He had worn it himself, years ago, on the day the doctors had told him the test had come back clear, the day he'd walked out of the medical station into the Caldwell's Reach afternoon, and stood in the parking area with the smell of the soil and the sound of the wind, and understood, in his body before his mind caught up, that he was still in the world. "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah, I know." He made coffee. She watched the kettle the way she always did, that absolute attending attention, and he thought for the 100th time that this was what she did with everything. She paid full attention. Not the performative attention of someone who is waiting for their turn to speak. Real attention, the kind that sees. He had been trying to live that way his whole life, and he had never managed it half as well as she did without apparently trying. She drank her coffee black. She had arrived at this decision on day 2 after watching him prepare his own, and he had the sense she had run a precise internal calculation and arrived at an optimal conclusion. He had started drinking it the same way out of peer pressure, which was not something he'd expected to experience at 47 from an extraterrestrial navigator. They were at the table when the second knock came. This one was different from the first, not a Keth delegation. The sound told him that immediately the rhythm was wrong, and when he went to the door the person on the other side was Myra Adami from 3 houses down, who was 62, and had a face like a cliff face, and had served on the settlement council for 14 years, and was the only person in Caldwell's Reach that the Keth administrators actively tried to avoid arguing with. She looked at him. She looked past him at Ale, who was visible from the hallway, standing very still the way she stood when she was processing a new variable. "I heard," Myra said. "Word travels," Daniel said. "Dowett from the grain office was watching when they came. He called me." She paused. "They're going to come back with paper." "I know. Paper means it's official. Official means you're not just a man with a woman in his house. You're a man obstructing a registered compliance action." "I know what it means." She looked at him for a moment. She had known him for 6 years, which meant she knew the shape of his stubbornness, knew it was the kind that didn't move. "We could say she's your cousin," Myra said. "She's Enhari." "I know she's Enhari. I've lived under the occupation for 11 years, Daniel. I know what Enhari look like." She paused again. "I'm saying we can try. The paperwork is slow, if she can move." She stopped speaking. The thing that stopped her was Ale, who had come to stand in the hallway without either of them noticing her approach, which was not a thing Daniel had thought a person could do with a wooden floor, but apparently the rules were different for Enhari navigators. She looked at Myra. Myra looked back at her with the directness of a woman who had spent 14 years on a settlement council and was not in the habit of flinching. They stayed that way for a moment. Then Myra made a small, precise nod. It was the nod she used in council meetings when she had heard something she considered accurate, had considered it, and had reached a conclusion. "We'll need more help," she said. She was talking to Daniel, but she was still looking at Ale. "And we'll need to move tonight." What happened next happened in a day and a half, and involved 8 people and a series of decisions that were not dramatic in themselves, but were, collectively, the most serious things that had ever been done in Caldwell's reach in living memory. Myra called in favors. Old Dowett from the grain office had a van and was willing to use it. The Kovacs brothers, who farmed the eastern plots and had their own long history with the compliance apparatus and their own set of reasons for it, were available and handy, and asked almost no questions. A woman named Petra, who ran the seed exchange, and whom Daniel had always thought of primarily as someone who kept very accurate records, turned out to also be someone who understood how the Keth's administrative timing worked, which days were slow, which stations were understaffed, which gaps in the coverage existed because no system designed by administrators is ever as complete as the administrators believe. Aya watched all of this. She watched the way she watched the kettle, with that total attending attention, and Daniel, who was by this point at 47 years old the kind of man who had run out of capacity for surprise about most things but found himself still capable of it, watched her watching them and understood that she was not just observing. She was navigating. Not with the restored mechanism in her neck, not yet. He did not fully understand what he had done to it, what he had interrupted, whether it was working or partially working or working in some modified way. He understood later that he had not fixed it, not exactly. He had changed the frequency of the interference, and in doing so had given her access not to the full compass of her ability but to something narrower and more local, the shape of this place, this settlement, this network of roads and people, and the invisible pressures of trust and fear that governed them. She was navigating human space. She was reading the settlement the way she would read a sky. On the second evening she came to him while he was loading the last of what he was sending with her, seeds, mostly, and a hand-drawn map of the region that he knew was inadequate, and that he drew anyway because it was what he had, and she put her hand on his forearm and stopped him. He looked at her. She held her own hand up between them, palm outward, the way she had on the first night. He put his palm up, mirroring her. She moved her hand forward until the tips of her fingers were touching the tips of his. It was not a human gesture, or not only a human gesture. It was something else, something that translated across the gap between what she was and what he was because it was not built from either of their languages, but from something prior to language, from the place where meaning lives before it becomes a word. It meant, "I see you." He understood this the way he understood music, and he kept his hand steady and he said, "Yeah, same." She was gone before dawn. Dowett's van, Petra's timing, the Kovacs brothers at the relay point 12 kilometers east. The route Ale had drawn for them on the inside of a seed catalog cover in marks and symbols that Daniel could not read, but that Petra had photographed, and that 3 weeks later would reach a Enhari community 200 kilometers north, and would be understood there as something precise and navigational and invaluable, the way all maps are invaluable, even the ones drawn in unfamiliar languages on the backs of farming supply catalogs. He stood in the kitchen after she left and drank a coffee and looked at the table where she had sat, at the 2 flattened areas where their hands had rested, at the marks she had left on the seed catalog. Outside, the snow was still. The compliance notification arrived, as Myra had predicted, 9 days later. It was stamped and countersigned and referenced 3 sections of the Occupation Cooperation Framework, and it was the most paper Daniel had ever seen generated about a single action he had taken in his life. He signed for it. He read it. He put it on the kitchen table. The Keth officer who delivered it had been different from the first 4, younger, something uncomfortable in the way it held itself, the way people are uncomfortable when they have been given a task they cannot entirely believe in. It had stood on his doorstep and delivered the notification with the rote precision of official procedure, and then it had said, quietly, before turning away, "The person you assisted is listed as a navigation casualty." It is the official position of the administrative division that navigation casualties do not require shelter. Daniel had looked at it. "What's your position?" he said. It had looked at him for a moment with its secondary eyelids doing something he couldn't read. Then it had turned and walked away without answering, and Daniel had understood that some questions were too dangerous for some people to answer out loud, and that the question itself was enough. The months that followed were grinding. The compliance apparatus was not built for speed, but it was built for persistence, and persistence was what it had. There were hearings. There were more forms. Myra was invaluable in the ways she was always invaluable. Precise, unapologetic, with a lawyer's memory for what had and had not been said, for what the actual written rules permitted versus what the administrators would prefer they permitted. The settlement held together the way communities that have been under pressure for a long time hold together. Not joyfully, not without argument, but with the particular tenacity of people who know that the alternative to holding together is dissolution, and that dissolution is what the pressure is designed to achieve. A year after Ale left, a message arrived through a route that was not official, and that Daniel would not have known to check if Petra had not shown him how. It was not in any language he could read. He photographed it and sent it through the same route it had arrived by, which Petra said was the correct protocol. 2 months later, an answer came back. Petra sat across from him at the kitchen table and translated it in pieces, halting, because her Nhari was limited to navigation vocabulary and formal registers, and the message appeared to be neither. What the message said, as best as they could render it, was this. She had reached her people. She was home. The mechanism in her neck had been fully restored by an Nhari physician who understood what Daniel had done to it and had called the modification extraordinary, not because of its technical sophistication. It was not technically sophisticated, but because of its intention, because it had not tried to fix the unfixable. It had worked with what was there. A Nhari concept, the physician had said through the message, that they rarely encountered in other species. She sent her name, the full version, all 3 syllables, including the 2 he couldn't hear. Daniel sat with the message for a while. Then he got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the gate at the end of the path, which still didn't latch properly, which he had been meaning to fix since the summer before last. He had a clear memory of standing at this window and seeing her through the frost-feathered glass, her on her knees in the snow, her arms wrapped around herself. He had crossed the path in his socks. He still couldn't fully account for the socks, for the speed with which he had moved, for the complete absence of hesitation. He thought sometimes about what the Keth officer had said on the second visit, navigation casualty. He thought about the phrase with the same quality of attention he brought to a broken mechanism, turning it over, looking at where it failed, understanding the design. The phrase was designed to make her disappear, not just from the record, from the category of things that deserved response. If you were a casualty of your own navigation, then whatever happened to you was your own fault, and no one owed you a door. He had not known any of this when he crossed the path. He had not been making an argument. He had not been taking a position. He had seen a person on her knees in the snow, and he had opened the door because the door was there, and he was behind it, and she was on the other side. Simple, not easy, simple. 18 months after Ale left, the first Nhari emissary made official contact with the Caldwell's Reach Settlement Council. This was not a coincidence, which Daniel understood only gradually, and which Myra had apparently understood within the first week of the compliance hearings. The Nhari had people everywhere, not spies, not in any sense that mapped to the word's human connotation, but navigators, which meant people who paid attention to the shape of things, to where pressure was building and where it might release, to the places in any system where change was not just possible but incipient. They had been watching Caldwell's reach for years. They had been watching the settlement the way Ale had watched the kettle, with full attention, the kind that sees. What they saw was a settlement that had, under sustained pressure, found the line and stood on it. The emissary's name was something that translated, approximately, as voice of approach. She sat in the council chamber, and she spoke through a translator of significantly higher quality than the Keth units, one that managed warmth and humor, and something that moved in the space between words where meaning lived before it was captured. She said that the Enhari did not make political gestures. She said that what they were proposing was not an alliance, not in the human sense of the word, not a mutual defense arrangement or a trade agreement or any of the forms that relationships between species usually took after first contact. What they were proposing was something for which human language did not have a satisfying word. Something like a shared practice of paying attention. Danel sat at the back of the council chamber. He had not been asked to speak. He was there because Myra had asked him to be there, and because he trusted Myra's instincts about when his presence was useful, even in silence. Voice of Approach had nearly finished her address when she paused and turned, and looked directly at him with those precisely calibrated eyes. "The navigator who sheltered with you," she said, "sends this." She placed her right hand flat on the council table, palm upward. The room was quiet. Danel got up from his seat at the back of the room and walked to the front, and the council members made room for him without being asked, which was unusual enough that he noticed it, and he placed his right hand flat on the table, palm to palm with hers, and the room was still quiet, and the quality of the quiet was the kind that happens when something that has been waiting a long time finally arrives. He thought about a kitchen table at 3 in the morning. Two people who couldn't speak each other's language, both hands flat on a surface between them. The meaning you can carry without words. The things that cross the gap not because you have built a bridge, but because the gap turned out to be smaller than anyone told you. He thought about socks in the snow. He thought about the tractor manual, still open to the same page. He thought about a woman he would never see again, and a conversation they had never technically had, conducted entirely in the language of hands and attention, and the small exact actions of a person who has decided to stop letting the impossible be the reason not to try the possible. Voice of Approach looked at him. "She says," she said carefully, "that you taught her a thing she did not have a word for. She has been trying to find the right word in your language. She thinks perhaps it is this, that the door and the person are to a human the same object." Danel thought about this. "I don't know if that's exactly right," he said. "She says you would say that." He laughed. The sound rang out in the council chamber, and Voice of Approach's expression did the thing that Ailes had done, not a smile, but something performing the same function, something that recognized the sound from the place in experience where all equivalent things are stored. Outside, through the high windows of the council chamber, the morning was clear and cold, and the light came across the step in long flat angles that made the snow look like it was lit from within. It was the same light that had been coming through the kitchen window on the first morning, when he'd crossed the path in his socks and found her on her knees, when the world had been balanced on a very small point that a lot of people had decided did not need to hold. It had held. Not because he was extraordinary. He would have resisted this characterization vigorously, and anyone who knew him knew not to try it. Not because he had made a calculation and found the odds acceptable. Not because he had political conviction or galactic foresight or any of the qualities that the story, as it would eventually be told, would try to assign him. Because she was there. Because the door was there. Because he had socks on his feet and coffee in his hand, and a tractor manual open to the same page, and a gate that didn't latch, and a spare room full of seed catalogs, and a bread maker he'd been meaning to fix. And all of it was exactly as it was, and exactly as ordinary as it had always been, and he had opened the door anyway. Because what else do you do when there is a person on their knees in the snow on the other side of it? What else do you do? The session continued for 3 hours. Danel sat at the council table and contributed when Myra asked him to and said little otherwise, and drank the water that someone had put in front of him without asking, and listened with the full quality of attention that he had learned from a navigator who had sat at his kitchen table and shown him how. At the end of the session, when the formal proceedings were concluded and people were beginning to move, and the room was loosening into the comfortable low noise of a meeting that had gone well, Voice of Approach came to stand beside him. She was not as tall as Ale, and her eyes were a different variety of that same nameless color, and she held herself differently, but she had the same quality of attention, the same weight of presence, the same sense of a person who was always slightly more aware of her surroundings than the room expected. She told us, Voice of Approach said quietly, that the first thing you said to her was, "You're freezing." I imagine she was. She said that it was the first time in 3 years of occupation that anyone had named a fact about her condition, without requiring something in return for the naming. Danel considered this. He looked at his hands, at the coffee ring on the table from his water glass, at the long cold light coming through the windows. "That's the minimum," he said. Noticing, "That's just the minimum." Voice of Approach looked at him. "Yes," she said, "and yet." And yet, he carried those 2 words with him for a long time afterward, the way you carry things that are small and heavy, and yet. The minimum offered freely without negotiation in the dark and the cold. What it cost, almost nothing. What it changed, everything. This is the kind of arithmetic the universe runs on, when it runs well. A gate that doesn't latch, a door that opens. 2 sets of hands flat on a table in the dark. The gap between them the width of a language neither person entirely speaks. The meaning passing through anyway, because that is what meaning does when you let it. When you stop filling the space between you with all the reasons it is not possible and simply stand in it, in the cold, in your socks, and hold it open. The formal proceedings between the Enhari emissary and the Caldwells Reach Settlement Council continued for a further 6 sessions spread across 3 months. Danel attended all of them. He was not a council member and had never wanted to be, had in fact actively declined Myra's suggestion twice in his years at the settlement, not out of disengagement, but out of a clear understanding of where his skills were and were not useful. He was good at specific things: engines, soil, the patient attention required to nurse a failing crop through a bad season, the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided to wait out whatever the weather is doing. He was not a strategist. He was not a diplomat. He sat in the council sessions, and he drank his water, and he listened. And when Voice of Approach turned to him in those sessions, which she did perhaps once a meeting, not to put him on the spot but in the way a navigator checks a landmark, he answered honestly with whatever he actually knew, which was usually less than anyone wanted but more than anyone else had. What was being negotiated in those 6 sessions was not, technically, a political arrangement. Voice of Approach had been clear on this from the beginning, and she was a person who was very clear on things. The Enhari did not recognize the categories of alliance and treaty in any way that mapped to human political structures, which had initially frustrated the 2 council members who had prepared for the sessions with extensive research into interspecies diplomatic frameworks. What the Enhari recognized was something they called, through the translator, something approximate to a shared practice. A set of actions performed in parallel, a method of paying attention to the same things at the same time, without requiring those things to be identical. It sounded abstract. It was not abstract. It was, as Danel understood it, and he was the first to acknowledge that his understanding was limited, the difference between an agreement about a relationship and the relationship itself. The Enhari were not interested in agreements. They were interested in what you actually did. He understood this. He had always understood it. He had grown up with a father who said the same thing about farming and about people in language that was considerably less sophisticated but identically true. What you do in the easy times is practice. What you do in the hard times is who you are. You can't negotiate your way to being the person who opens the door. You just have to open it, over and over in all the weather until it's not a decision anymore. The compliance hearings ran in parallel. They were conducted in a separate administrative track that had no awareness of the council sessions, which was itself a structural fact about the occupation that Myra found worth documenting, and that Danel found depressing but not surprising. The occupation's left hand and right hand were not in regular communication. The compliance apparatus proceeded on the assumption that what it was enforcing was still being enforced. The council sessions proceeded on the assumption that enforcement was, in the medium term, becoming irrelevant. Both of these things were happening simultaneously, in the same settlement, in the same weeks, and no one in the compliance office knew about the latter. And Danel found something darkly funny in this that he kept to himself, because it was the kind of humor that required explanation, and explanation would make it less funny. He was called to the compliance office twice. The second time, the officer who saw him was the same young Keth who had delivered the official notification on the doorstep, the one who had asked whether he understood what compliance meant, and then said, quietly, before leaving, that the official position was that navigation casualties did not require shelter. The young Keth looked at him across the compliance office desk with those secondary eyelids doing the thing he still couldn't read, and it asked him a series of questions that were clearly written by someone else, the same questions, in slightly different order, that he had answered at the first hearing. He answered them the same way he had answered them at the first hearing, accurately, briefly, without apology. At the end of the session, the young Keth said, not reading from any document, "You understand that the official record will reflect a finding of uncooperative behavior." "Yes," Danel said. "And that this may affect the settlement's compliance classification." "I understand." A pause, the secondary eyelids. "Then, the settlement's compliance record is otherwise clean." "I know," Danel said. "I've signed the forms." "You sign them every month." "Yes." "That requires reading them." "It requires signing them. I read them because that's how I was brought up." Another pause, longer. The young Keth looked at the desk surface between them, which was the Keth equivalent he had come to understand of looking out a window. Then it said, very quietly, not for the record because the recording had been concluded, "She was not assigned to this sector. We don't know how she came to be in the settlement district." Danel looked at it. "Navigation casualty," he said. The young Keth's secondary eyelids blinked. "That is the registered classification." "Right," he stood up. "Well, I hope she got home." He was almost to the door when the young Keth said, still quietly, "The navigator, her biological compass. It was modified before she was left in the sector, modified in a way that prevented resolution." Danel stopped. "That would mean," he said carefully, "that someone wanted her to stay exactly where she was." The young Keth said nothing. "It would mean," Danel said, "that navigation casualty is not exactly the right phrase." A very long silence. Then the young Keth made a small precise sound that the translator unit on its collar did not render. It was below the unit's threshold or outside its vocabulary, and Danel understood it the way he understood Aile's untranslatable sounds. Not the specific meaning, but the shape of the meaning, the place in experience it occupied. He understood it as, "You are correct and I cannot say so, and I am sorry." He nodded once. He went home. He stood in his kitchen and drank a coffee and thought about what it meant that a young Keth official had told him something, in the space of a conversation that could not appear in any document. He thought about the gap between what was recorded and what was true, which was a gap he had been aware of his whole life in various forms, but which he was only beginning to understand as a gap that had a consistent shape, that the same pressure created the same space in every system, and that the space was where things happened that couldn't be planned for. He got out the tractor manual. He had not looked at it since the night Ale arrived. He sat down and read it, properly this time, and it turned out that the problem he'd been trying to diagnose for 4 months was in a completely different section than the one he'd been working through, and he fixed it in the morning in about 2 hours, and the sense of profound foolishness this produced was clean and almost pleasant, the specific relief of a thing done wrong for a long time being done right. He thought about this later as a way of understanding what had happened in the broader sense. Sometimes you are working on the wrong section. Sometimes you have to stop and sit at the table and let a navigator show you the shape of the problem before you can find where it lives. 2 years after Ale left, 3 things happened in the same month. The compliance hearings concluded with a finding that was not exoneration and not quite penalty, a kind of administrative limbo that Myra called a draw and Daniel called a bureaucracy running out of enthusiasm. The NHRE formally extended what Voice of Approach called an open-frequency relationship to the Caldwell's Reach settlement, which was not a thing the compliance apparatus had a form for, and which it therefore could not process. And the young Keth, who had told him things off the record, submitted a report to the Keth Administrative Division on a subject that was not Daniel, not the settlement, and not Ale. A report that Daniel would not know about for another 4 years. A report whose subject was the practice of deliberate navigator disorientation, and its classification as policy, which was the kind of thing that only gets reported when someone has decided that some things are too heavy to carry indefinitely. None of this was dramatic, none of it happened at once. It happened the way seasons happen, in the accumulation of small weather, the slight daily shift of light and temperature, the things you only understand as change when enough time has passed to show you the difference between where you were and where you are. Daniel kept farming. He fixed the gate in the spring. It had been bothering him for 2 years, and he finally had both the right part and the time, and the latch caught cleanly, and he tested it 3 times standing in the cold morning air. It worked. He considered this for a moment, the feeling of a thing fitting the way it was supposed to fit, and then he deliberately left it slightly unlatched because the habit of an open gate was a habit he had decided he wanted to keep. The bread maker he fixed that same week. The seed catalogs from 4 years ago he finally threw out, except for one, the one with Ale's marks on the inside cover, the navigation symbols he still could not read, which he had framed, badly, with materials from the hardware store in a frame that was slightly too small so the edges buckled. It hung on the wall beside the kitchen window where he could see it in the morning. He had asked Petra once if anyone had translated all of it, and Petra had said yes, and had offered to tell him what it said, and he had thought about it for a moment and then said no. Some things you understood without translation. The meaning was there in how she had made the marks, careful, certain, the specificity of someone drawing not a record but a gift. He knew what it said. He had known since she drew it, he just couldn't prove it. The kitchen window still had the same frost pattern in hard winter, the same feathering at the edges where the cold found its way in. He still drank his coffee at the kitchen table in the early mornings with something to read open in front of him, still mostly not reading it. He still kept the porch light on, had always kept it on, had developed the habit young for no particular reason, and had never seen a reason to break it. The light was on the night she had come. The light was on every night. This was not significance. This was just what he did. The porch light was on because he had left it on, the same way the gate was unlatched because he had left it unlatched, the same way the door had opened because he had opened it, and all of these things were just what he did. The accumulated practice of a person who had made a series of small decisions over a long life that were not dramatic and not calculated, and that added up, over time, to a person. That was all, that was everything. Voice of Approach told him on the last of the formal council sessions that the Inhari word for what he had done that night, for the specific act, the crossing of the path, the opening, was a word that also meant a kind of navigation, not wayfinding, not pathfinding. Something more precise, the act of recognizing that you are already in the right place and moving from it. He sat with that for a while. Tell her, he said finally, that I'd have done it for anyone. Voice of Approach looked at him with those precisely calibrated eyes. She knows, she said, that is the point.